Welcome to the Unwashed Asses, episode 56, recorded Monday, October 8th, 2018. We're doing it live. Just got a dabble of Everness's sweet World of Warcraft ambience music and themes in the background. We're doing Karazhan tonight because we have a fitting topic. You know, boogity boo, we've got October rolling around here. Did I say it's episode 56? It's episode 56. I'm really tired. It's after 9. This old man's got to get to bed. But before that happens, we have to make creaky noise chairs and talk about Nosferatu. So October, I want to make sure we cover classic horror movies. Last year we did... I guess you'd say it's lesser known origin stories of classic monsters. But this year, I wanted to cover, classic movies, things you can get, things you can rent, things I love. Now, I personally prefer the classic horror movies, like the old black and whites, the Universal monster films, and I think I've told this in the past. Mostly because you do get a true sense of horror. There's a sense of artistry. There's a morbid beauty to the way the movies are shot, the stilted acting, and the overall scores. It's just beautiful. Turn that up there. Turn it up. You don't get in modern horror movies. Things have moved away from, a slow burn, an actual lasting impression of horror, to jump scares and gore fests. Things like, Hostel and Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street. And all of them do have their place in horror. It's just, not my personal preference due to what they are. I'm not there to watch people get chopped up and scream endlessly, for a solid 5 minutes, or even more disturbing things like The Hills Have Eyes, where there's, it's probably my least favorite genre of horror film would be the redneck schlocker. God, I am. Whew. It's gonna be rough. Buckle in. So, anywho, with classic horror, you have to go and work your way back. Can I turn that down? It's a little bit loud in my head. Now, most would say that the Universal monster movies definitely kicked off everyone's general interest into horror as a whole. If we take a look here, this one's we're gonna be interactive here. There's Universal monsters. Looking shit up here on the fly. Alrighty. So they actually started off pretty damn close to what we had with Nosferatu. Nosferatu is, of course, the 1922 silent film starring Max Schreck and put out by who was it? Prana Film, their first and only movie. But Universal followed quickly on their heels with The Hunchback of Notre Dame in 1923 and Phantom of the Opera in 1925. Apparently those were silent films as well. I've not seen those. I need to fix that. And you know what? This is the month to fix it. So every week here we're going to be covering a new classic horror film, and maybe it is just a thing of we work our way forward in time. But I had always considered, or always believed, I should say, Nosferatu to be like the premiere, like the start. It's where everything's kicked off. Not done any research to back that claim, though, so I could be totally wrong. But it's hard to go much further back than 1922 and get anything super sensible out of it. In fact, things like Nosferatu here, I had only seen about half of it, I'd say, back when Netflix had it ages ago. went ahead, purchased it on Vudu recently, and sat down, dedicated the time to watch it. And it was an interesting experience in that I remember not really caring for it just because of how long the movie seemed. When in actuality, it's only about an hour and a half. But the way the movie's told is what made it seem to drag on for me. Now, we can go into backstory here where the entire basis of Nosferatu is essentially this unlicensed story of Dracula. Well, let's see if we can find who actually wrote it here. But it was contracted out and was actually not even essentially, it was just straight up an unauthorized adaptation of Dracula. Who wrote it here? Founded, named, So let's see here. Okay, so it was Henrik Galeen. He had to write the screenplay inspired by Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. So they didn't obtain the rights. And while it very much appears to be a love story to Dracula, it's one that ultimately doomed the company because it was their first and only film. The Stoker widow had sued the company into non-existence to the point they declared bankruptcy just to kind of get out of it. Nothing ever happened with it. But the interesting thing with the case was that the presiding judge had ordered the film destroyed. Let's see if we can find here. So, yep, this was the only Prana film. The company declared bankruptcy after Stoker's estate, acting for his widow, Florence Stoker, sued for copyright infringement and won. The court ordered all existing prints of Nosferatu burned, but one purported print of the film had already been distributed around the world. This print was duplicated over the years, kept alive by a cult following, making an example of an early cult film. And the version that we have, or at least the version that Vudu has, is the original film itself, as well as combined with supposed extra shots that were in a re-release. So there was a 1930s sound version called Die Zwölfstund ein Nacht des Grauens, the 12th hour, a night of horror. It was an unauthorized and re-edited version of the film that was released in Vienna on May 16th, 1930, with a sound-on-disc accompaniment. It had an alternate ending that was happier than the original. Let's see. And then this version, of which the director, Murnau, was unaware, contained many scenes that were filmed by Murnau but had not been previously released. Also contained additional footage not filmed by the director himself, but instead by a cameraman, Gunther Krempf, under the direction of an unknown Dr. Valdemar Rager, supposedly also as a film editor and lab chemist. So, let's see, in the recent 2012 restoration of the film, the Friedrich Wilhelm Murnau Stiftung claimed they have several copies of that version. It was originally banned in Sweden, however the ban is... Okay. So it is a combination of a few of the different versions. At least that was my belief based on what we had on the initial streaming. Like the Vudu version, or at least the digital copy, has a few brief paragraphs as far as what is being shown to you and why it is what it is. Now, back to the story. It is, again, just a complete lift of Stoker's Dracula, but instead of it being, like Jonathan and Mina Harker, with Harker being a real estate agent from London going to meet with Count Dracul in Transylvania about buying property. It's instead focuses on a character, fuck is his name? As Thomas Hutter and his wife Ellen. So Hutter is still a real estate agent, being employed by a rather skeevy-looking guy, Knock, who says, oh yeah, this Count Orlok over in Transylvania would like to purchase some property, and the property itself is an abandoned, it looks kind of like an industrial complex across the street from where Hutter lives. So it's actually based then in the fictional German city of Wisborg. Now, it starts very dramatically in the sense of we have the happy couple of Thomas and Ellen Hutter. Quickly moves into Knock getting a mysterious letter from this Count Orlok, and it's already implied right away that because the movie does away with several characters like Renfield and Arthur and Quincy, and it really condenses it. So in Dracula, you had Renfield, who acted as a servant to Dracula through some form of contact. It was never really made explicitly clear if it was indirect or there was direct contact. But it happens closer towards the arrival. No, I'm sorry. It was direct. I totally forgot. Yeah, Renfield was the previous real estate agent sent out to meet with Count Dracula. And then Harker went out in his stead to finish the deal. So Renfield came back batshit crazy. You don't have any of that subplot, and it does just start with Knock getting the letter from Count Orlok, who's standing in for Dracula, that he wants to buy the property. Now, the letter itself, as shown in the movie, just has a lot of interesting hieroglyphics and arcane letters on it. It's nothing that really makes any sense when you're looking at the film. But it is pretty much directly implied that Knock is deep in the pocket of Count Orlok, but there's no real reason given for it. Knock then assigns Hutter to head out to Transylvania, meet with Count Orlok, seal the deal, get it all done. We have a short scene where Thomas has to go deal with his wife Ellen in the sense of making arrangements for her to stay with their friends. He seems super excited and jazzed about it, and this is not necessarily a disconnect, but my first observation with the silent film is because so little talking is actually being done, because they always have to bring up the placards with the text on it, the actors themselves are forced to convey a lot more emotion than you would otherwise expect, and it doesn't always make sense. Hutter himself, the guy who played him, Gustav von Wangenheim, he smiles a lot more than you would expect a person in his position to. And I understand he's very happy with his wife Ellen, but when he's telling her he has to go off to a land of phantoms and demons, because that's what he's heard of Transylvania, he's smiling like a madman. And it could be that I'm misinterpreting it. He seems happy and overjoyed, and he could very well be, because he has this opportunity to advance his career, even though it's not mentioned in the film, or he's just excited at the prospect of an adventure. But based on the text that's actually displayed, you get the impression that he's scared of the adventures he's going to go on. And the way the acting is done is it sends mixed signals. And then contrasting that, we have Ellen, who is just almost overly so in a very pensive or terrified state. Everything that Thomas tells her just it seems to throw her over the edge. Like, this lady needs a fainting couch in every single room, because her emotions are just gonna, take her, and she will have a spell. Now, after getting his wife settled in a very long, drawn-out goodbye sequence between them, we have Hutter taking cats are going crazy. Taking his trip out to Transylvania. He stops at an inn for a dinner. We are not subjected to the same journalistic stylings as what we had with Harker, detailing, the meals he was having. Instead, it's a very demanding Hutter saying, "Well, hurry up with my food because I'm going to see the Count Orlok." And then we have the locals who are like, no. Clearly, they're very scared of Count Orlok and everything that is implied with him. But they also then discourage him, saying that there's a werewolf out on the prowl. So we see Hutter get his lodgings, and he finds a book on Nosferatu, and it tells of the demon and his effects. And this is the other bit with the silent film is because no one can talk or convey what they're reading or what they're seeing, things like books are, at least in this film, again, my experience is limited, are displayed very earnestly on the screen as far as like, oh yeah, here's the cover. Here's the page he's reading. And because we expect the audience to read, it's up on the screen for, 2 to 3 minutes. Now, during this, while he's paging through and reading the book, we do, of course, see the purported werewolf. I'm using pretty big air quotes here because it looks very much just like a hyena. And there's several shots of very startled and scared horses running away from it. It's not even snarling. It's not aggressive. It's not scary in what we would consider, like, oh yeah, it's jumping around. It's snarling. It's just this hyena-looking thing skulking around in some bushes. And it's the way the movie is shot. It leads me to believe, at least, that Hutter's supposed to be seeing this, and the terrors of Transylvania are starting to get to him. Either way, he gets his dinner. Gets his sleep, wakes up refreshed, ready to go. He takes a coach to up into the mountains near Count Orlok's castle, but eventually hits a point where the coachmen just won't go any further, and they're all like, "Oh, you can pay us whatever you want. We're not going any further." And it could be because night's coming on. It's hard to tell because it reminds me of classic 50s TV, specifically like The Legend of Zorro, where things weren't shot at night probably because of expense, and then proper lighting was just, it ties hand in hand. Either way, everything was shot at day and then tinted down, or the lighting adjusted to make it appear at night. So when we see this, quote unquote werewolf harassing these horses, or the coachman not wanting to go any further because it's night, you really have to pay attention to the tones and the lighting is to get an idea of what's happening or what time of day things are occurring. Now, I don't know if it's the case with previous releases of the film, but in the version that I watched, it will actually swap a color palette entirely, and it seemed to follow different themes in that early morning was a pink or rosy hue. Home scenes were always shot in kind of like an amber. Count Orlok's, anytime he was on screen, was usually in like a sickly green color. And then it would cycle through and seem to be very thematic, which helped kind of place things as far as, okay, here's what I should be feeling now, or here's the time of day that this is kind of occurring. But it required a lot more attention on my part to pick up on these subtle cues, and really made it more enjoyable because it actively engaged me. Whereas, like I've been watching The Flash season 4, and I'm not sitting there actively paying attention to it because there's so much going on. I kind of start to tune it out, and because it's kind of like getting a very thin sandwich. It's very meager. There's not much to eat there. Whereas Nosferatu, it's so different, where it's not necessarily a meaty sandwich, but it's a dish I'm so it's a dish that's so alien and foreign to me. I have to sit and process what I'm looking at and what I'm experiencing, and it really helped to engage me more with the movie than I have been with really anything else in a very, very long time. So as Hutter reaches the pass where the coachmen say, "Oh yeah, no more. We're done with you." Much like, and I'm gonna try and stop from here on out making allusions to Dracula, because aside from just essentially content being cut and a few other things, I'll only mention the changes. I'm not going to mention, oh yeah, like beat for beat, it's hitting this. Only if there's something significant. So Hutter is approached by a black coach covered in long flowing black drapes. The horses have black gowns on them, and there is a coachman who's covered in black garb and looks very much like the Count Orlok character himself. Now, this is one point of contention. I've always seen discussion regarding this with Dracula. I've heard it from both sides that the coachman that ferries Harker to the keep is Dracula, or is a servant of Dracula as a coachman. With Nosferatu, it very much looks like Count Orlok, and even if you don't know it's Nosferatu or Count Orlok, you do know what he looks like. It's the tall, skinny, paraffin-skinned vampire with the bald head and the large nose and the two fangs protruding from the front two teeth instead of the canines. He's got the long fingers with the claws on them, and it is almost like a clergyman's jacket. It's very, very iconic. And the coachman looks very much like him. So it's never touched on, much like many subtleties in the film. It's left for you to guess, but I don't know that it's even that important. It stuck out to me, though. So Hutter gets to the castle, at which point Count Orlok immediately begins chewing his ass out that, you're late. All my servants have gone to sleep, but you've taken so long to get here. We skip to a scene where then it's the iconic dinner scene where they're going over no, actually, Nosferatu, they're not even going over the deal. Hutter's grinning like an idiot eating his food, and is almost disgusted with Nosferatu's appearance, which at this point he's wearing quite a lot of clothing. He's got a hat on, so he looks odd, but it's not this vision of terror that we've come to, what we're used to. And as he's cutting a piece of bread, Hutter cuts his thumb, and Orlok then tries to suck the blood out. And it's not subtle. Again, it's very overt, like, oh, this is what's happening here. And Hutter starts to display characteristics of what I'm starting to see in like Lovecraft's writings, where I always thought it was just the way Lovecraft wrote his characters as far as being very weak-willed, but anytime something remotely supernatural or horrific happens, much like Ellen was prone to doing, Thomas Hutter almost, he begins to pale and back away, and wants to faint and cower, and he loses all will. And for whatever reason, Orlok backs off on the attack and leaves Hutter to his own devices. Now, Hutter, for whatever reason, just decides to pass out in the chair, and he wakes them next morning. Now, he doesn't really consider too much what happened between him and Count Orlok, but he does pull away his collar, and there are 2 fresh punctures on his neck. So clearly Orlok had fed on him. Now, he doesn't really consider what could have happened. It's not mentioned again because the film has all the subtlety of a blunderbuss. It's relying so heavily on the acting and what's happening in the scene then, because it doesn't have the ability to speak directly to the audience, verbally. And it can't be, paragraph after paragraph of text up on the screen for you to read. It's very ham-fisted in the way the story moves around, where, again, you're lacking subtlety, you're lacking nuance, you're lacking detail. Things that would greatly add and contribute. It makes me want to, write and embellish on what's happening, but I realize I would just be writing Dracula all over again and not to the same effect as Bram Stoker. But Hutter just doesn't really seem to give a shit about what happened. So he's going around, it's all sunshining, and he's writing a letter to his wife saying, "Oh yeah, I got bit by mosquitoes, and there's terrible things going on here, but don't worry about it." All the while he's smiling like an idiot still, and just kind of taking in. And it's a beautiful castle, beautiful countryside. Manages to find a guy on horseback. He's like, hey, doesn't even really talk to him. He just holds up a letter and shakes it at him. And this brings another a distinct difference. So in Dracula, Dracula himself encouraged Jonathan to write letters to Mina, at which point it was made clear that Dracula was reading the letters, and he would then send them out. However, none of that happens in Nosferatu. It's just a direct, oh, hey, I wrote this letter, here's the courier, let him get that out. And it seems to contradict with what we were seeing before on the coachman not wanting to take Hutter to Count Orlok's castle. They shied away, whereas this one courier, who doesn't even, there's nothing clearly identifying him as a courier. He's dressed very similar to the villagers we saw at the end. So I don't know why Hutter gave him the letter. But yeah, he just rides right up to the castle gate, like, whatever. Here's this letter from a stranger. I'll take this on back. Not a problem. Now, later that night, of course, we have another scene with Count Orlok where he agrees to sign the documents. So he purchases the house across from Hutter's home, and he notices a picture of Hutter's wife. And he talks like, "Oh yeah, she has a lovely neck," which is just odd as fuck. And now Hutter's starting to get weirded out. He is recalling the book that he had picked up in that it's literally just titled Nosferatu, which is an allusion to him being a bird of death. Now, in his room, he's cowering, he's afraid, and it takes a turn because it appears to be very sudden that Orlok is now just openly preying on Hutter. But Hutter does exactly what he did before with the cowering and hiding. He doesn't even try to, lock the door. Instead, he goes and hides on the bed and literally covers his face with the blankets and then passes out. Now, when I think a more modern sensibility, when Orlok attacks Hutter, one of the, I don't know if you'd call it a power, or it seems to be more of a cinematic presentation. Doors just open on their own for Orlok. So when he goes to Hutter's room, we have the classic image, which I have up on the stream right now and will be on the YouTube, of the door opens on its own and you have Count Orlok standing there, ramrod straight. It's very creepy, and in imbues that sense of horror into the viewer. It's one of those lasting images, and why I like the classic horror movies so much, because it's not about the immediate jump scare. It's about building that sense of dread and creepiness, and it's something that it lasts and lingers with you. Now the door opens on its own. Orlok's standing there. We start to see the camera work of shadows. This is something that is iconic for Orlok, where anytime he is preying on somebody or going after them, we see the shadow doing the work, in the sense of, not even in the sense of, with Hutter, we see the arms creep up and the attack commences, and after it's done, the arms creep back down. But while the attack is happening, we flash back to Ellen, or flash over to Ellen, where she's still sleeping at her friend's home, but she awakens and is almost like in a trance as she walks towards the balcony and gets onto the rail and starts walking. And the husband, what's his name? Ship owner Harding comes into the room and catches her just as she's about to fall, and he starts shouting, and they need a doctor and a doctor. And as the doctor arrives, Ellen shouts Thomas's name. She's still in the trance, but now Wikipedia is saying that she's able to see Orlok in the castle threatening her unconscious husband. I don't recall that. But the doctor, in all of his wisdom, is like, oh yeah, she's got blood congestion. Which, the fuck does that mean? That does nothing to explain. Like, oh yeah, it's like old-timey doctors. Yeah, you got ghosts or some shit in your blood. Better do cocaine about it. It's just... And I don't know if it's a product of the time, because this is supposed to be taking place in 1838. I don't know if the writing's intelligent enough for that, or the writer's just like, oh yeah, no, blood congestion's totally a thing. My Uncle John died from it. So the next day, Hutter, totally okay. He seems really no worse for the wear, but he's definitely now perturbed by Orlok, and he's gonna figure out what's going on. So he starts exploring the castle. Very quickly finds the crypt in which Orlok is sleeping. He's in his coffin. Now, the coffin's a bit of a weird situation, because it looks like the top of it's been hacked open by an axe. And so even with the lid closed, you can clearly see Orlok's face. Now, I might have been wrong, and it's just like a viewing portal. But Hutter does just something extremely dumb, and he just flips the lid off the coffin and lets it sit there. I thought for sure Orlok was going to wake up and just have none of this and finally finish off Hutter, but he still lays there. He does nothing. Hutter runs away. A few hours pass. We start to see QuickTime events. I should say QuickTime, but sped up film work where Orlok is now... this is something that... Orlok's a very hands-on fella. Now, Dracula had hired out people to fill the coffins with the dirt from his castle and get it all loaded up, whereas Orlok's handling all that himself. Now, I don't know if it's like a budgetary restraint where they didn't have the money to hire extras to handle something like that, or if it just there wasn't the forethought for it. It's curious to see such a discrepancy, especially when Orlok had mentioned that he had servants before, but we never see a single servant. Nor do we see like the three brides of Dracula. It seems to be he's living a very solitary existence. So Orlok very quickly loads up the coffins. We start to see another visual effect where after loading the coffins, he gets into the one on top of the pile, lays down, and then kind of like shitty stop motion animation, we see the lid to the coffin work its way up and then settle on top. And then it takes off. Hutter then, he like, he's not locked in his room, so I don't know why he does this. He starts tearing up the bedding and makes a makeshift rope to climb out his window. He falls 3 feet at the end and then knocks himself out. What's less clear is how he makes it to a nearby river, where some rivermen floating a raft down find him. They take him to a hospital, and it takes days and days and days for him to recover. After he's recovered, though, he immediately begins to hurry home. While this is happening, we see that Orlok's coffins have been transferred to the harbor. For whatever reason, the crew takes one of the coffins, they crack it open, they see that it's filled with dirt, and then knock it over, and rats start pouring out of the dirt. Now, if I had hired out somebody to take care of something super important, like, say, shipping several large containers across the sea for me, I'd be a bit miffed that they decided to break one open, which could explain Orlok's actions, in that he starts killing them one by one. Now, again, I don't know if it's a budget constraint or a deliberate choice as far as what we see, but there are only 3 sailors. It's implied that there are many more, but we only ever see 3, with the captain, the first mate, and then just 1 sick sailor. The first mate goes and gets the captain and says, "Oh, hey, we have an issue. This guy is sick." Captain comes, checks it out, and the guy shortly dies thereafter. And we get a piece of text popped up on the screen saying, "Oh, one by one they all fell ill, and the captain and the first mate had to get rid of them." To the point where they're getting rid of the last body, chucking it overboard, and the first mate's like, "Hey, I'm gonna go finish this, but if I'm not back in 10 minutes, ... So he goes down there, he starts hacking up the coffins, and we see more dirt and rats pouring out of it. Orlok wakes back up. He's like, "The fuck is going on here? Paying for a pleasure cruise? I'm just trying to get across the sea. I may or may not have murdered several of the crew. What gives?" First mate gets just super wigged out and throws himself overboard. Now, at this point, the captain lashes himself to the wheel, and Orlok then finally comes up and makes him the last victim. So we get another piece of text saying, "Oh, through the foul breath of Nosferatu, it hurries into port." And it gives it like that otherworldly, supernatural feel. Like, oh yeah, the ill omens and bad tidings and foul air of Nosferatu sailed the ship even closer towards port. And this is one point where the movie definitely drags on. We have a lot of shots going back and forth of Hutter going through the woods, heading home. And we have a lot of shots which may very well be the same shot. It's really hard to tell them apart, of the ship sailing towards the port of Wisberg. And this goes on and on and on and on. And I know it's meant to convey distance and time, but earlier in the film, we had Hutter move very quickly from London to Transylvania. It didn't make sense that he was able to get so quickly to Transylvania and then had a hard time securing passage back to, Wisberg. And if the paranormal air that is powering Orlok's now commandeered ship is so great, why is it taking so long for the boat to get there? It's also, I don't know the word for it here, unbelievable that Hutter and Orlok essentially arrive at the same time back in London. We have it's an excellent establishing shot of the port city of Wisberg and the ship coming in very ominously. But let me see if I can find where we left off here. So the ship arrives, and Orlok then just... Again, nobody seems to really give a crap what's going on here. Orlok takes one of his coffins, and in the sped up footage, just walks into the home that he had purchased. It's not until the next morning, based on the description I'm reading here, that the police finally show up, inspect the ship, and then find that the captain's dead. They do read the logbook where it's then assumed that they're dealing with a plague. It's not... It's made clear enough, but it's not handled well. The writing in the film is very... it has the subtlety of a blunderbuss, and it's still not always clear what's meant to happen. It could be me. It could be the translation, because again, it's originally a German film. They are very direct people, but it still felt like I'm getting mixed signals. Like, oh yeah, this is happening, but this other effect of it doesn't seem to line up. So that was something I had read in several breakdowns of the film, where Nosferatu is essentially this bird of death that, unlike Dracula, carries the plague into Wisburg. It's at this point that a lot of people supposedly start dying. I didn't see evidence of this, where I would have expected something like Bloodborne, where we have many coffins lining the streets, or we have the plague doctors moving from home to home, condemning the sick or burning the dead. Instead, we just have a lot of upset villagers, and they're blaming the original real estate manager, Knock, who had since been committed to a psychiatric ward, much like Renfield. And he does the typical, like, oh, the blood is life, the blood is life. He's eating flies, and he eventually turns attention to spiders. But again, we're lacking the nuance. We're not really getting in depth with the character. So he never explains the reasoning of, like, oh, I need to eat a spider because it's worth more life than a fly, and I need to eat a mouse because it's worth more, and oh, could I please have a kitten? A kitten would be the greatest thing ever. We get none of that. So much is just glossed over. Now, when I think of who did Dracula? Was it I think so. Yeah, Francis Ford Coppola. When he did Dracula in 1992, we got all that breakdown with what's his name? Tom Waits. He did an absolutely fantastic job as Renfield. But we get none of that with Knock. So essentially a witch hunt begins, and the townspeople chase after Knock after he escapes. He murders the warden, but he gets away, he climbs a roof, and then uses a scarecrow. I don't remember the scarecrow. But it quickly then cuts to Orlok staring at Ellen, because again, he's across the way from her. He's staring at her while she's sleeping, and we do get a supernatural element to it, where she's being drawn to him, and he's looking very creepily out at her through his own broken windows. She then opens the window. I totally glossed over the fact that Hutter had returned. And it was a very heartfelt reunion that, oh, everything's going to be all right. I'm back home. None of the sickness or caretaking that happened with Harker when he returned. Instead, it's like, oh, yeah, no, that's behind me. And no mention of, oh, yeah, this terrible count and bad things are happening. Something awful is going to come. None of it. But he does warn against her reading the Nosferatu book that he had. But despite his wishes, she reads it, and it's discovered that the only way to defeat a vampire is for a woman, quote unquote here, who is pure in heart, to distract the vampire with her beauty all through the night. The idea being that he's going to get so distracted by how hot she is that the morning sun, he'll ignore the first crow of the cock, as it said, and the sun will destroy him. Now, as she awakens Thomas, she still has the window open, and faints. Now, Thomas wakes her up, but she tells him to go fetch Professor Bulwer, who had appeared before in the film, but it didn't make much sense. Now that I think about it, it was a very shoehorned way of getting him into the film. But after he leaves, Orlok comes in. He starts drinking her blood, and much like the book said, he totally forgets about the coming day. So there's literally a shot of a rooster crowing. Orlok, it's like, oh shit, I done fucked up. It says here, he tries to flee, but it didn't really look like fleeing to me. We have him creeping away from her. He's inside. He has nothing to worry about from the sun. Instead, he walks directly into an open window here and lets the sun hit him. It didn't make sense. He turns into a puff of smoke and dies. Hutter and Bulwer return, and we find, Ellen's dead. The last shot is that of Orlok's castle in ruins, and supposedly symbolizing the end of his reign of terror. So, again, very thematically, and it's hitting the broad points of like, this is Dracula through and through. There's been minor changes, most of which detract from the original story. We don't have the subplot with Van Helsing and the vying of affection for Mina and Lucy from the other two gentlemen. God, what were their names? Arthur and Quincy. We don't have the in-depth dive on Renfield and the backstory of the real estate deal which originally brought Dracula over. None of it. And it's frustrating, but also beautiful in the simplicity. There's no second guessing. There's no real overthinking that needs to happen. It's just sitting back and letting the story be told and enjoying it. I'm going to go back to like a sandwich analogy here, where it's a very simple meal, but it's very good in what it does. It doesn't have to be more complicated than what it is. It's almost a thing of you don't realize you want it until you've had it. I'm so used to films and books and games being almost overly complicated in what they're trying to do, and the many subplots that they're trying to tell, and the subtleties and details that are being brought to light. Things like, with Infinity War, where we have dozens of heroes and multiple intertwining stories, and this really brings it back to basics. I'm going to compare it back to like reading Lovecraft, where it's easy to see what's going to happen in the story miles away. You know what's going to happen before it even happens, and it's something similar with Nosferatu. But you have to remember that these people were telling these stories, almost 100 years ago, and how far ahead of the curve they were. And that's what really then gets to me, is like, oh, okay. They didn't have the Shyamalan-esque twist at the end. It was very straight-faced, and we were dealing with supernatural entities that most normal folk had never even heard of, except in the occasional legend. And so you didn't have to go overly complex. Simple was best. And what we get then is again, simple film, but an effective one. Most notably, we have the soundtrack, which doesn't really seem to line up in some parts, but it was, I want to get this right here. Original score composed by Hans Erdmann. It was to be played by an orchestra during the projection of the film. The original music was recording during a screening of the film. However, most of the score was lost, and what remains is only reconstruction of the score as it was played in 1922. So thus, throughout the history of Nosferatu screenings, many composers and musicians have written or improvised their own soundtrack to accompany the film. It's good, but again, it doesn't fit. Much like Hutter's overly joyous smile in scenes that one would suspect more abject horror, it doesn't fit. At the same time, though, it's very melodic, it's very enchanting, it pulls you in. There's just some pieces where it doesn't fit, and it could be because the score, part of it was lost. What sticks with me, though, and I'm sure sticks with most viewers, are the visuals, where we have, again, you may know it without even realizing what it is, where you have the scene of Nosferatu's shadow creeping up the stairs as he heads towards Ellen's room. You have, as I said before, the scene of Orlok in the doorway overlooking the sleeping form of Hutter. The way his arms move in shadows to open or attack. It's almost without equal in the way that it's used. It's so iconic. And I have a hard time thinking of other movies that have employed, again, what is relatively a very simple effect to such great purpose. If not for the uninspired story, it's almost worth watching for the artistic value alone. I mean, stories, it's weak. Acting is rough. Even Orlok himself, he comes across as very stilted and not super menacing because he does look so awkward. Again, in a modern context, he's just not scary. But in the context of the film, it works. And it's, the appearance of Orlok is something that has lasted, again, close to 100 years. And we've had things like Vampire the Masquerade have an entire sub-race of vampires based around him. And it's not something that will go away despite what was once a humble beginning. So, wow, I got a lot more out of this than I thought I would. 53 minutes here. So that's gonna end it here. Let's see if we can find it streaming anywhere. Streaming. That way you guys can know if you can get it. Okay, so Amazon Prime has it. Otherwise, I did buy it on, again, Vudu. It was $8.99 there. Google Play has it for $7.99. Apple has it for $9.99. So you are able to watch it in a plethora of different places, but it looks like it's for free on Prime right now. So that's going to wrap it up. I think next week we're going to do Bride of Frankenstein. Otherwise, if you have any other recommendations, let me know. And then, of course, if you want to support the show, head over to patreon.com/0and09. Pitch in $1 or $2 a month. That's all we ask. It keeps things flowing here. And, of course, tell friends, family. I'm still working on the iTunes thing and then also Spotify, so I'll keep you abreast there. You'll probably see that the album artwork has changed as well as the title. We'll get into that on the next episode. But, of course, you want to write a message, you want to contribute in the feedback, theunwashedasses@gmail.com. Again, theunwashedasses@gmail.com. Drop us a line. We'll read it on the show. And, yeah, that'll do it. We'll talk to you